Order, please. Before we begin the daily routine, the three House leaders have a copy of lineup for question periods for opposition days and for Tuesdays and Thursdays as a result of the change of seating in the House. Actually, what will happen for today is that the House leaders can follow along there up until question 6. The list will stay the same. In other words, the official opposition will get questions 5 and 6. Then after that, we'll alternate between the two opposition parties for today only. Then tomorrow we'll have a more permanent, I guess, schedule to follow. Everyone understand? Okay. Thank you. Yeah, the honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Well, we agreed to that today. I believe that, you know, our people in our office will have a look at this and report back to you and the leader of the NDP as to whether or not we're in agreement with this or we have some other suggestion to make.
As I explained to House leaders, I had based this formula based on an average of 50 questions per week, but obviously the parties want to go back and look at percentages of representation of the House versus number of questions, so that's certainly agreeable, yeah. The honourable member for Staff Cobequid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And in keeping with that, of course, too, what we will be doing is looking at what the traditions have been in the way that the questions have been divided up in previous sessions based on the composition of the House at that time. And I think it's a very easy matter to get a listing, for example, of the order of questions when the House composition was similar but different.
Same thing but different. Thank you. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the honourable member for Cape Breton Nova was probably going to rise on the same point as I'm going to make, is that the last time we had this situation in the House, I believe the person who was sitting as an independent was only given one question a week, I believe.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
If I might, I don't know if we need to get into a formalized liturgy here as to how many questions and in what order, because it's the right of any member of the House to ask a question. And in the British House, the clerk picks a question out of a box and reads it out loud, and the minister prepares a response to that and delivers it the following day, after which the official opposition, the third party, and the government each get an opportunity to ask a supplementary question. That's the practice in the British House. All three parties get in on every question. Now, there's no reason why that can't be done here if members on that side want to ask questions. And I would encourage them to do so, Mr. Speaker. I think it is wrong to set up a formal rule of the House whereby the right to ask questions is limited to members of the opposition and not to members of the government.
Thank you. What? Before we begin the daily routine, I just want to rule on an issue that was brought forward by the honourable member for Cape Breton South. The honourable member for Cape Breton South rose on a point of privilege last Friday. The matter was taken under advisement by myself, and I'd like to deal with the matter this afternoon. The thrust of the honourable member's complaint was that an advertisement placed in a local newspaper was to the effect that certain government policies were described as being implemented rather than yet to be considered by this House. And I believe that the honourable member presented that case at that time. His complaint was the advertisement was akin to the situation that presented itself actually in Ontario in 1997. I've reviewed both the honourable member's complaint as well the decision of the Speaker in Ontario, and I'm satisfied at this point there was no prima facie case of breach of privilege based on that newspaper article or advertisement at the time. The advertisement was clearly for informational purposes only and does not obstruct or impede either the House or its members from discharging his duties. The other matter of privilege that was brought forward by the honourable member for Cape Breton South was to the effect that the Premier's announcement outside of the House of the date for the delivery of the budget was in fact, again, in his estimation, a breach of the privilege. And again, for the reasons I stated earlier, I find that the the announcement to be in the essence of information only, as opposed to being a prima facie case of breach of privilege. Anyone would like a copy of the decision? Welcome to it. The Honourable Member Cape Breton South.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank you very much for the quick response to my point of privilege. Needless to say, I don't agree with your decision, but I'll have to abide with it.
You respect it.
Thank you. I thank the Honourable Member for Cape Breton South for that. We'll begin the daily routine, presenting reading petitions. The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a petition on behalf of 600 residents. And the prayer on the petition is basically, we, the undersigned residents, citizens, and commuters are deeply concerned over the condition of Route 289 from Brookfield west through Pleasant Valley, the so-called Cement Plant Road, including the Fields Road. And thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Petition is tabled. Might add, before we move along, the subject of this evening's late debate was submitted by the Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley. Be it resolved that members of this House recognize the federal gun registry for what it is, an incredible waste of taxpayers' dollars for an ineffective method of curbing violent crime. Be debated this evening at 6 p.m. Presenting reports of committees. The Honourable Member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Chairman of Public Accounts, I beg leave to submit the annual report of the Standing Committee of Public Accounts 2001-2002.
Report is tabled. Table reports, regulations, and other papers. The Honourable Member, statements by ministers. Government notice of motion. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas registered nurses and licensed practical nurses are a vital part of the healthcare system and continue to adopt and adapt to new roles to support their patients. Whereas Nova Scotia nurses, nurse educators, employers, and unions have told us that leadership development is among their top 3 priorities. Whereas the Department of Health, through Nova Scotia's nursing strategy, is a major sponsor of a leadership conference for nurses called 21st Century Leadership, New Roles for Nurses, which begins tonight at the Holiday Inn in Dartmouth. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the legislature commend all nurses across Nova Scotia for their dedication and to providing high-quality healthcare services, and extend good wishes to the 350 nurses and special guests who will be attending the Leadership Conference, which will set the stage for more nursing leadership opportunities in the future. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Question for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Encourage Public Participation and Dissuade Persons from Bringing or Maintaining Legal Proceedings or Claims for an Improper Purpose and to Preserve Access to the Courts.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Encourage Public Participation, Dissuade Persons from Bringing or Maintaining Legal Proceedings or Claims for an Improper Purpose, and to Preserve Access to the Courts.
An act to encourage public participation and dissuade persons from bringing or maintaining legal proceedings or claims for an improper purpose and to preserve access to the courts.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Protection of Public Services in the Province.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham begs leave to introduce a bill entitled an act respecting the protection of public services in the province.
Bill 24, entitled an act respecting the protection of public services in the province.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Appointment and Duties of a Commissioner on Resources and Environment.
The honourable member for Hants East begs leave to introduce a bill entitled an act respecting the appointment and duties of a Commissioner on Resources and Environment.
Entitled an act respecting the appointment and duties of a Commissioner on Resources and Environment.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. The honourable member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 95-96, the Education Act, to ensure air and water quality in schools.
The honourable member for Timberlea Prospect begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act, to ensure air and water quality in schools.
Bill 26, entitled an act to amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act, to ensure air and water quality in schools.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. The honourable member for Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill, an act to amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage begs leave to introduce a bill entitled an act to amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act.
Bill 27, entitled an act to amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. Notice of motion. The honourable leader of the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Canadian Union of Postal Workers have produced a publication entitled Moving Mountains, Work, Family and Children with Special Needs about their Nova Scotia-based national program, and whereas this publication is intended to help people gain a new understanding of disability issues and spark ideas and action around everyone's shared responsibility to provide support to families with children with special needs. Whereas CUPW hopes the stories in this book will inspire other unions, employers, and governments to find more concrete ways to help build a more caring and inclusive society. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate CUPW and its members for their innovative and important national program for families whose children have special needs, and for the publication of Moving Mountains that pays tribute to a group of courageous and compassionate families. And Mr. Speaker, I'd request waiver and passage without debate.
Mr. Waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in opposition, the leader of the Tory party assailed the government of the day for not distributing gas to all Nova Scotians, yet he has not promised to do the same while Premier. And whereas he attacked the Liberal government for the royalty regime that embraced it when he came to office, and whereas the only benefit from the offshore came as a result of a Liberal government that allowed the Sable project to go forward. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of this House recognize that the Premier has failed to deliver on the offshore promise and that he is letting Nova Scotians down by stalling growth in the industry.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Bowater Mersey Paper Company, the Nature Conservatory of Canada, and the province of Nova Scotia have joined together to protect $2.9 million worth of land in the southwest part of the province. And whereas these 1,500 hectares are home to endangered species, rare plants, and 135-year-old forests that will now be protected from tree harvesting and other commercial activities. And whereas this project brings the amount of land Bowater has designated for conservation in Nova Scotia to 33,200 hectares, therefore be it resolved that the members of this House join me in expressing our gratitude to the Bowater Mersey Paper Company for their continued efforts to preserve wilderness areas in Nova Scotia despite difficult economic times in the forest products industry. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax-Shabuktawan, an introduction.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I would like to draw the attention of the members of the House to the attendance in the East Gallery today of a number of citizens who have travelled to visit us to express their concern about threats to the Tobiatic Wilderness area. Sue Brown of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, Mark Dittrich of the Sierra Club, and I think about a dozen or 15, well, my goodness, a dozen or 15 others who are here to show us that they're concerned about the survival of wildlife in the Tobiatic. And I'd ask the members of the House to extend a warm welcome to our visitors here today. Thank you very much.
Order. Order, please. While we welcome all Nova Scotians to this House and to the gallery, I'd ask our friends in the gallery to remove their paraphernalia if they would like to stay in the gallery, please. Thank you. Now, member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas healthcare in rural Nova Scotia needs innovative solutions to its problems of access to diagnostic facilities, and whereas breast cancer is the second leading cause of death among women after lung cancer, and whereas the Colchester East Hants Health Authority has spearheaded efforts and contributions by several groups and organizations to develop a program that will bring mobile, sophisticated imaging equipment designed to detect breast cancer in its early stages to rural communities in Hants East and Colchester County. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate the Colchester East Hants Health Authority and all of the contributing groups for their efforts to provide rural residents similar access to diagnostic imaging equipment that urban residents enjoy. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver, notice, and passage without debate.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 1998 and 1999, the NDP took the attitude that it did not matter that we had just had an election in Nova Scotia. What Nova Scotia needed most of all was another election in hopes that this would somehow catapult the NDP into power. And whereas the NDP holds itself out as representing sound judgment and prudent protection for the public purse, and whereas Volume 2, Mr. Speaker, whereas Volume 2 of the 1999 Nova Scotia election returns shows the cost to the taxpayer of holding an election as in excess of $3 million for election administration alone, never mind the cost to the candidates of running or to the political parties. Resolved that we are surprised that the NDP has not yet introduced a bill to amend the Elections Act to make it possible to hold an election every day of the week, as that surely would be a great step towards their view of democracy.
Order, please. The resolution is a bit long. Now, a member for Halifax Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Bayers Road Baptist Church is celebrating its 50th anniversary during the weekend of April 12th and 13th, 2003. And whereas the church has been a pillar of the Bayers Road Fairview community since its founding while drawing its congregation from around the Halifax Regional Municipality. And whereas the church's pastors, the Reverend Dr. Leslie McCurdy and the Reverend Carolyn King, lead the church in worship services, Christian education, and community outreach. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia House of Assembly congratulates the pastors and congregation of Bayers Road Baptist Church on the church's 50th anniversary and wishes them continuing success in the years to come. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas rural Nova Scotia has faced some of the worst flooding in our history, and whereas many roads and bridges have been impassable, if not washed away, making it extremely difficult for emergency crews to do their jobs. And whereas once again the Nova Scotia emergency teams, whether they are police, fire, or emergency health services, have risen to the occasion and performed to their very best. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this legislature congratulate those emergency workers in our province. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Westville Curling Club members are just completing their 102nd year of operation, and whereas a variety of tournaments, including provincial championships, have been held at the Westville Curling Club since it incorporated in 1909, and whereas the Ship Hector Curling Bonspiel has been another prominent curling event for the past 100 years or more at the Westville Curling Club. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House applaud the dedicated efforts of members of the Westville Curling Club and wish them another century of success. And I seek waiver of notice.
Waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax-Chebucto.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this government is threatening the Tobiatic Wilderness area and its population of endangered moose by allowing black bull resources to mine on the border of this treasured area. And whereas a number of concerned citizens have come to the House today and donned moose antlers, somewhat in jest, but also in full seriousness, to attract much-needed attention to the danger to the Tobiatic and its species. And whereas these individuals continue their fight to protect Nova Scotia's invaluable Tobiatic wilderness area, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly welcomes all the supporters of the Tobiatic and offers whatever support we can with their fight to protect the Tobiatic wilderness area. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver and passage without debate.
Question for waiver. I hear a no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 2003 Canada Winter Games were held in Bathurst, Campbellton from February 22nd to March 8th, 2003, and whereas Team Nova Scotia represented our province with dignity and strength, and whereas these young athletes work extremely hard for many years developing their skills in their chosen sport. Therefore, be it resolved, members of this legislature congratulate the athletes that took part in the 2003 Canada Games and wish them every success in the future. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Kings County band Cucamoon has released its first CD entitled Live at Fundy Folk, and whereas band members Kate Adams, Kathy Arsenal, Carrie Harlow, and Heather Holm have been making their original music since 1997, and whereas their CD is a mix of vocals, acoustic instruments, and crowd reaction during the live recording last year at the 10th Fundy Folk Festival, therefore be it resolved that the members of this House join me in expressing our congratulations to Cucamoon on the release of its first CD and wish the band much success in its future endeavors. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Truro Irving Timberwolves won the Bantam Girls Championship at the 2003 Justin Coward Memorial Basketball Tournament. Whereas the Truro Irving Timberwolves defeated the Billiker 8th grade team from Boston in a well-played, fast-paced, and entertaining championship game. Whereas the Truro Irving Timberwolves players continually improved their basketball and life skills while members of the team. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulate the Truro Irving Timberwolf players and coaches on winning the Bantam Girls Championship at the 2003 Justin Coward Memorial Basketball Tournament and for their outstanding season. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Guysborough, Port Hawkesbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice excuse me, that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas an idea in 1924, the Canada Games became reality in 1967 with the first ever Canada Games held in Quebec. And whereas since that first event in 1967, more than 40,000 young Canadians have participated in the Games, with over 40 different sports being represented. And whereas Team Nova Scotia's first medalist at the 2003 Canada Winter Games was Sherbrooke's Sarah Ackerman, who received the bronze medal in the women's air pistol competition. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate Sarah Ackerman for receiving the first medal for Team Nova Scotia and thank all those who participated in the 2003 Canada Winter Games. And I ask for waiver.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Sackville Blazers recently captured the Nova Scotia Junior B Hockey Championship, defeating the Straight Pirates in an exciting 7-game series. And whereas this is the first championship in the team's 27-year history. And whereas the Blazers leave today to compete in the Don Johnson Cup Atlantic Cooperative Insurance Junior B Championship in Mount Pearl, Newfoundland. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the Blazers, staff, coaches, and players on their victory and wish them best of luck this weekend in Newfoundland. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and pass it without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice on a future day I shall move adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Team Nova Scotia's flag bearer must be somebody who shows a strong commitment to sport, to the team, to Nova Scotia, and for the 2003 Canada Games opening ceremony, that person was Bedford's Nicole Doucette. And whereas she is presently a grade 12 student at CPL in high school, Ms. Doucette plans to continue her sport at university level, where she will pursue a degree in kinesiology. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Nicole Doucette on being chosen to be flag bearer for Team Nova Scotia and wish her success in her future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Tourism and Culture.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Order of Canada recognizes Canadians that have made a positive impact on the lives of others and is our country's highest honour for lifetime achievement. Whereas Janelle Cameron of Glencoe Station is one of these exemplary Canadians being honoured. Whereas Mr. Cameron has been instrumental in the Cape Breton music industry for decades, blazing a trail for other Cape Breton artists. And he has also been credited with the growing revival of Celtic music in Canada. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate Janelle Cameron on the receipt of the prestigious Order of Canada and thank him for his contributions to the music industry and wish him continued success in the future. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Tourism and Culture.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Order of Canada recognizes Canadians that have made a positive impact on the lives of others and is our country's highest honour for lifetime achievement. And whereas singer, songwriter, and motivational speaker Terry Kelly of Cole Harbour is one of these exemplary Canadians being honoured. Whereas Mr. Kelly has been blind since childhood, has won 6 East Coast Music Awards, an indication of the high regard in which his peers and the public hold his singing and songwriting ability. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate Terry Kelly on the receipt of the prestigious Order of Canada and wish him success in the future. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Order, please. The Honourable Member Cape Breton South.
Speaker, obviously we're about to go into question period, and we've been informed earlier today that the Premier would be in his seat at the start of question period today, and a number of our questions are dedicated to the Premier and his office today, and I would ask maybe the Government House Leader to tell us if in fact the Premier is going to be here, and if he is on his way, can we have a short recess until he gets here?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier is on his way. He's visiting some of the areas around the province which have been affected with the storm that we had on Monday and Tuesday, and is expected momentarily. But however, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest we continue with question period, and we have an hour and a half, and the Premier will certainly be here very shortly. In fact, I'll make inquiries now as to how long he's going to be.
Orders today or questions put by members. Question period begin at 2:40 and end at 4:10. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to draw the attention of the Minister responsible for insurance to Hattie Dyke, who is sitting in the above him in the gallery. Hattie Dyke is 71, in perfect health, and has a clean driving record. Yet her insurance company will not renew her policy until she releases her medical information. Mr. Speaker, Hattie Dyke is convinced that she is being targeted because of her age.
She is.
Minister, the release of medical information is an invasive, personal, and confidential matter. Today, Mr. Minister, will you explain to Hattie Dyke why insurance companies are being allowed to discriminate against seniors?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I can assure the lady in the gallery that she's not alone, and I share with her the problems that she's facing with insurance companies. This government is determined, Mr. Speaker, within the next few weeks to come forward with a plan that will hopefully at least stabilize rates and make them fairer to all applicants for insurance.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it's no secret that insurance companies are looking for any and every excuse to raise rates. The demands for medical information are made randomly, no matter what the health status of the individual, and based solely on age. Mr. Speaker, allowing insurance companies to demand private medical information has gone too far. The Ham government has demonstrated, of course, that they don't have any problem with pressing seniors to pay unfair bills, and especially bills that other people don't have to pay. I would like to ask the Minister for a full answer, not a half answer. How do you plan to stop the discriminatory practices before the next election?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can assure the Leader of the Opposition that his ranting is not going to solve the problem. This government is determined to resolve the problem, and they will resolve the problem.
On your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, forcing seniors to provide private medical information that nobody else has to provide is discrimination. Hattie Dyke says insurance companies are grasping for ways to get seniors off the road, and in fact, Mr. Speaker, this government is playing its silent partner. Shame. I want to ask the Minister, what will it take for you to stop allowing insurance companies to discriminate against seniors?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has asked the wrong person on this side that question, because I'm a senior, perhaps too senior. And I'm determined to continue to drive, my friend, and I can assure the honourable member opposite, Mr. Speaker, that we have a plan, we have a program, and we'll have it in effect in the very near future.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday we saw the real face of Premier Ham as during a media scrum he suffered from a sudden bout of fiscal amnesia. Not only did the Premier say he could not recall promising his government would live within its means, he also could not recall saying that he promised he would not add to the debt. Yet, Mr. Speaker, on page 1 of his Blue Book, to a letter to fellow Nova Scotians, the Premier stated, quote, "I am absolutely committed to the principle that the government of Nova Scotia must live within its means. Borrowing hundreds of millions of dollars and mortgaging our children's future without so much as a plan is simply wrong." Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is, why have you failed to keep your word by continuing to mortgage our children and your grandchildren's future?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite the member's question would have far more relevance if he was not a member of a government that reported surpluses when there were huge deficits.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I will apologize for my 8 months as a minister in a minority government when your Minister of Finance apologizes for having been a minister for years in a Buchanan government that bankrupted this province. Mr. Speaker, not only did the Premier say he would not add to the debt, he also said he would not use taxpayers' money at election time to try to win votes. Yet his government has announced $700 million in promises beyond their mandate, including $335 million that would go directly to the debt. My question to the Premier is, at what point, sir, will you put your promises to Nova Scotians and your personal integrity ahead of the cynical attempts by your party to get re-elected?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And over the last 4 years, this government has been doing exactly what the Blue Book says. It brought fiscal responsibility back to the province. It has, for the first time in 40 years, tabled a balanced budget. Tomorrow, the Minister of Finance will table another balanced budget. Mr. Speaker, this government has delivered on the Blue Book promises, and for the remainder of its mandate will continue to do so.
Member for Richmond on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the legacy that this Premier and this Minister of Finance have left over the last 4 years is $521 million more dollars to the debt of this province, something his grandchildren will pay for, all of our children will pay for, and something, sir, that you said you would not do. Right. Mr. Speaker, the practice yesterday, the Premier also said that the practice of adding $521 million to the debt for capital infrastructure costs was a practice used by respected, reputable companies throughout Canada, throughout Nova Scotia. Therefore, my final supplementary to the Premier, sir, based on that, will the Premier name one company that adds money to its debt, such as this government, without a plan, vision, or time frame as to when it's going to pay back that money? Name one company.
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite fails to recognize that this government has done very significant things to improve the fiscal strength of the province. As a matter of fact, it has been reported by outside agencies that the biggest fiscal improvement in Canada has been recorded right here in Nova Scotia by this government. And one of the initiatives taken by this government, Mr. Speaker, was to sell NSRL at the top of the market, putting $400 million of money against the debt of the province of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, seniors across the province are being targeted with skyrocketing insurance rates. The Nova Scotia Federation of Seniors and Pensioners says people over 70 are seeing major increases in their auto insurance. The Seniors Council in Inverness and Victoria is hearing the same thing. The impact of sky-high rates is being discussed by seniors clubs in Margaree. I'd like to ask the minister responsible for insurance, how do you plan to address the concerns of so many seniors that they are being unfairly targeted by the insurance companies?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, if the Honourable Leader of the Opposition is going to continue answering the same question, I'll continue to give him the same answer. We have a plan. Do you understand a plan? Mr. Speaker, the plan is just not going out and talking to some NDP members around the province and coming back and say the solution to this problem is to privatize the insurance industry in Nova Scotia. That's not the answer. We want to have a plan to put in place an insurance scheme that will meet the requirements of the people of this province, whether they're young, middle-aged, or old, whether they drive a car that's 20 years old or 2 months old. We want to put in place a plan that will take care of all those differences in age, whether it's people or automobiles.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
The minister responsible for insurance had it right. He wants to put in place a scheme that will continue to gouge seniors and others in this province. That's what they want to do, Mr. Speaker. That's what they want to do. This government is allowing insurance companies to target seniors like Ernie Whedon. He has a new car, Mr. Speaker. He's 75 years old with a clean driving record, and yet his insurance has doubled this year. He's been forced to release his medical information. Mr. Speaker, I would like to table a copy of the medical form now. Minister, I'm sure that the Premier can give you advice about the confidentiality of patients' records. My question to the Minister responsible for insurance is this. How many more stories just like this do you have to hear before you will start protecting the rights of the seniors in this province?
Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know how often we have to go through this. I've told the honourable member we have a plan. We're working on the plan. Their plan, Mr. Speaker, is privatized, is
Public ownership.
is public ownership of the insurance industry in this province. We've had experience with Sydney Steel. We've had experience with other ventures by government. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, we don't want any part of that. We are a party, Mr. Speaker, which will come up with solutions we have in the past and we will in the future.
Leader of the Official Opposition, on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister responsible for insurance doesn't seem to realize that the lowest insurance premiums in the country are all administered by public auto insurance companies. Mr. Speaker, my office learned today, Mr. Speaker, that another senior in Inverness has been forced to stop driving because she can't afford the increase in her insurance. In rural communities, driving a car, Mr. Speaker, is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And the Minister is engaged in pre-election stalling, and it just won't do. How does the Minister plan to lower auto insurance rates in this province before the next election?
Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we do not intend to take the action as suggested by the New Democratic Party. I can tell you that offhand. To compare the system that they have in Saskatchewan and Manitoba to the system we have in Nova Scotia is comparing apples and oranges because the benefits are different. If that honourable member
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Minister has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member had lived in Manitoba at any time, he would know that driving conditions are far different in Manitoba than they are out here on the East Coast. They have straight roads, they have flat roads, Mr. Speaker, and that makes a difference to premiums. And, Mr. Speaker, the benefits paid by the insurance...
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Richmond. Order, please. The honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, it's amazing how the Premier's words are coming back to haunt him here in this House. And to help him with his memory lapse that he has lately, I want to remind him of his statements in an article in the Chronicle Herald, which the Premier said on March 25, 2002, quote, 40 years of borrowing and deficit financing has grown into an $11.6 billion debt. That's what we're leaving our children and grandchildren, end quote. Mr. Speaker, the Premier made that statement just a little over a year ago, making it 41 years of continued borrowing. So my question to the Premier is, after 4 years in government, 4 years of being able to do what you promised Nova Scotians, why are you entering this province into its 42nd year of borrowing?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite obviously has a burr in his saddle because this government has accomplished something that the government of which he was a part could never do, and that is bring in a balanced budget. Simply put, Mr. Speaker, what this government is doing, it's step by step by step solving problems. Solving problems in finance, solving problems in healthcare, solving problems in education, solving problems in road infrastructure. We did never say that we could fix everything all at once. All we said we would be is better than the previous government, and we proved that.
The honourable member for Richmond on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it is this Premier, you, sir, who told Nova Scotians you would not add one cent to the debt of this province under your administration, and you, sir, have failed in that promise to Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, in the same Herald article, the Premier said, quote, "To be sure, there are some people who suggest that government should continue borrowing on its debt and spending beyond its means. I don't believe there is merit to this argument. Such an approach might feel good today. However, we need to ask ourselves, who pays for it tomorrow?" My question to the Premier: why does the Premier now feel that there is merit in a government that continues to spend beyond its means year in, year out?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I know in his zeal to excite his colleagues in his caucus, the member opposite has actually gone a little beyond what is in fact the case. The government never said from day one that we would have a balanced budget. We said we'd have a balanced budget in year 3. And obviously, the first step in dealing with the finances of the province is to deliver a balanced budget. We didn't say we would do that the first year or the second year. We did it in the third year, and we'll do it again in the fourth year. And the current expenditures of the government in terms of capital expenditures are all looked after in general accepted accounting principles in that they are amortized. So the true debt which we inherited is something that we will look after with surpluses, but the amortized debt is something we look after each and every year according to general accepted accounting principles.
The honourable member for Richmond on your final supplementary.
Mr. Premier, this is your picture. This is your picture where you told Nova Scotians you would live within your means.
Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member knows he can table any document he wishes, but not to hold it up in the House as a prop. Thank you. The honourable member for Richmond has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, it is you, Premier. It is your face that is on the Blue Book that says that you would live within your means. It is you, sir, that after 4 years have added $521 million onto the debt of this province. Tomorrow, your Minister of Finance will stand in this place and try to fool Nova Scotians into believing he has a surplus without telling them that he is still borrowing another $100 million in his next budget. That is the reality, sir, and that is where you have failed to keep up your commitment to Nova Scotians. My final supplementary is, why has the Premier set aside his own principles and his own integrity, and now he believes it is okay to continue to run a government that lives beyond its means and will leave the burden to his grandchildren and our children for years to come?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite is aware that outside agencies have examined the financial structure that this government has brought to the province of Nova Scotia. They have indicated that the budget is balanced. They have indicated very clearly that the biggest financial improvement in all of Canada has occurred recently in Nova Scotia under this particular government, and we will continue to make improvements. We will continue to be fiscally responsible, and we will continue to build a future here for the young people of Nova Scotia, something that member should support.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, while the minister responsible for insurance sits on his hands, Mr. Speaker, the cost of auto insurance in this province to seniors continues to rise. The number of uninsured drivers on our highways continue to rise. And worse, Mr. Speaker, the minister responsible for insurance, instead of speaking up on behalf of Nova Scotia, takes it upon himself to defend dividends paid to people outside of this country, Mr. Speaker. It's shameful. My question for him is this. You said today that you have a plan. 2 weeks ago, you said you were consulting people. Which is it?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, Insurance 101 for Dummies would say that you're out there consulting to develop your plan.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that must be the name of the book that the minister's the author of, is all I can say, Mr. Speaker. He's the one who put forward the plan, the so-called road ahead. The road ahead, Mr. Speaker, which severely limits the options that Nova Scotians will have. Mr. Speaker. It's all about restricting benefits. So I want to ask the minister responsible for insurance, is it your plan to do what they have done in New Brunswick and to restrict the benefits that the people in Nova Scotia can receive under their insurance policy?
Honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, it's passing strange that this same member that's advocating a publicly owned, a publicly operated insurance system, which does have caps, which does restrict, it does restrict the amount that a person can claim for damages after an accident. Which is he in favor of? Is he in favor of tort restrictions, or is he in favor of no tort restrictions?
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister seems to forget how this works. We ask the questions, they answer them, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell the minister that what he ought to do is actually go and have a look at public auto insurance companies like the one in BC, which don't have limits or caps, please. Mr. Speaker.
Order, please.
Or the choice system in Saskatchewan. He should have a look at them. I got one simple question for the minister. If he has a plan, table it.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, we will have a plan. We will make that plan available to the New Democratic Party so they can go around the province and demonstrate to the people around the province that indeed the government does have a plan.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Yesterday, the Premier couldn't remember the promises in his own Blue Book. So I'm hoping that last night he did some bedtime reading, because I have a question today on a promise that's contained in that book. On page 7 of the Blue Book, and I'll table page 7 for a reminder for the Premier, Mr. Speaker, it states that during its first mandate, a PC government will stop spending taxpayers' money on politically motivated advertising. Mr. Speaker, this government has spent more than $50,000 in the past few weeks trying to buy votes by promoting the Tories' tax and health promises and printing some glossy publications trying to convince Nova Scotians that after 4 years, they finally really care about things such as high insurance rates. So my question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, is why is the Premier breaking this promise to not spend taxpayers' dollars on politically motivated advertising?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And one of the criticisms that by many was directed towards the previous government is that they had no plans, and clearly put, when we came into office, we did find, in fact, there were no plans. Over the course of the last 3.5 years, the government has put forward a plan for health care. Your Health Matters. It put forward a plan for education, lifelong learning. It put forward a plan for energy development. It put forward a plan for opportunities to develop the economy. And clearly put, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are interested in these plans. For example, the Lifetime Learning plan, in addition to the 2,500 copies that we had made, we had over 33,000 hits on the internet for people wanting to know what these plans are. When governments make plans, something that previous governments often fail to do, people want to know about them, and we're going to make sure that people do know about them.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier knows, Mr. Speaker, that is not what he said when he was in opposition. The Premier knows he has broken a promise to the people of Nova Scotia. This government and this Premier, Mr. Speaker, have tried to convince us that advertising is about informing Nova Scotians about the business of government. But we know that advertising is about the Tories attempting to buy votes, Mr. Speaker. How can you spend over $11,000 on promoting the Tories' tax cut promise? How can that be about informing Nova Scotians when the tax cut hasn't even been introduced, Mr. Speaker, when the tax cut hasn't even been voted on, and when the tax cut won't come into effect until the next government is formed? So, Mr. Speaker, my question again to the Premier, why is he insulting the intelligence of Nova Scotians by trying to lead them to believe that this advertising is about anything more than just Tory vote buying?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite knows that the people of Nova Scotia have a right to know what it is government is doing. They have a right to know what it is government is planning. They have a right to know how the actions of government will affect their day-to-day lives. People have to know these things, and we will let people know these things. Now, if the member opposite thinks that this is somehow influencing the people of Nova Scotia, I certainly hope it is, because we want the government of the people of Nova Scotia to know what this government is doing.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier knows that Nova Scotians are not being fooled by this, Mr. Speaker. They know this pre-election advertising campaign is at their expense, Mr. Speaker, and they know that the Premier has broken his word.
Once again.
They also know that the Premier is not the man of integrity that he pretends to be.
Order,
Mr. Speaker.
order, please. Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. Every member in this House is considered to be an honourable member, and I'd ask the honourable member to retract that because that was unparliamentary.
I will retract that comment, Mr. Speaker, but I
Member for
am saying...
Glace Bay on your final question, please. Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Glace Bay on your final question.
Ashamed of your government, not myself. Ashamed of your government. I'm not apologizing for your government.
Please.
You should be ashamed of your government.
Order, please. The honourable member for Glace Bay on the final question, or I'll call for another questioner.
My final question to the Premier, I'm asking him to commit here, today, right now, to instruct the Tory party of Nova Scotia to pay for that election propaganda and not the Nova Scotia taxpayer.
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And is the member opposite complaining that we have an economic development plan? Is he complaining that we have an energy strategy? Is he complaining that we have a health plan? Is he complaining that we have a plan for education to make this the best educator in Canada? If these are the things that the member is complaining about, then what does he have in mind if he ever returns to this side of the House?
For Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question's for the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, this winter, Nova Scotia families felt the government's hand in their wallet more than ever, from the windfalls on insurance premium tax, the HST on home heating fuel, the increase in gas tax, or any of the other $200 million plus in Tory taxes and fees. Nova Scotia families now have a harder time making ends meet than ever before. In the lead up to their provincial budget this Thursday, the government has talked a lot about helping out, quote, working families. The Department of Finance has told our office that this government will shortly be amending the revenue allocation formula for the HST. So my question for the minister is simple. When will the minister do the only reasonable thing, give today's families a break, and take the HST off of fuel oil?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, in regards to the HST, it is an agreement that was entered into the Government of Canada, along with two other provinces outside of Nova Scotia, that is Newfoundland and Labrador, and also New Brunswick. The terms and conditions of the HST being applied is that it's applied in the same manner as the GST. The member opposite is well aware of that. And the situation is, Mr. Speaker, that HST now applies to things such as fuel oil, which it didn't in the past, but obviously overall the percentage has gone down overall because it used to be GST plus PST, which is about 18.8%, Mr. Speaker. Overall, it's gone down to 15%. It does apply to items that weren't there before, but there is also some refunds that are mailed to every household in Nova Scotia if their income level are below certain amounts.
Now, member for Halifax Fairview on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it continues to amaze me that a government that has shown tremendous ingenuity in raising hundreds of millions of dollars in new taxes and user fees can't find a way to put money back in the pockets of Nova Scotians who've had to choose sometimes between eating and heating their homes. The province collects HST on every litre of heating fuel sold, and it is reaping a significant windfall. It did reap a significant windfall this winter of at least $1 million per month. That is money for which they did not budget, but which they got simply because of the outrageously high price of fuel. Yet, when they had a chance to give it back to Nova Scotians, they gave them $50. Mr. Minister, when will you admit that the only reason your government will present a year-end forecast update tomorrow with showing a $14 million surplus is because this government is keeping the tax windfalls from the HST and the tax on insurance premiums?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, in regards of HST, we've had this debate before. HST is a consumer tax on consumable goods. Many people in Nova Scotia are in a situation that they have discretionary spending. They spend on many different items. Obviously, things such as heating oil are things that they have to have. I don't argue that, Mr. Speaker, but overall, the situation is one that HST, we didn't have a windfall in regards of the price increase in fuel oil. The fact of the matter is that I do appreciate that for many Nova Scotians that they have spent more on fuel oil this winter, and that is a fact of world oil prices rather than HST policy.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview, and your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What the minister and this government don't seem to recognize is that when heating fuel costs go up 68% like they did this winter, you can't cut your heating costs by 68%. Mr. Speaker, most families can only afford heating fuel by cutting back somewhere else, going into debt, dipping into their savings, buying less food. Mr. Minister, will you lift the burden off Nova Scotia families by giving them a badly needed break on the HST on fuel oil? Will you make that commitment?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, in regards of the HST policy of this government, HST has been in place now, I believe, since 1996. It is a policy that was put in place before. It's going to continue. I should point out also that one of the reasons that the provincial government gives an HST rebate to our citizens is to compensate for things such as that. But I will point out the member opposite is correct, and this year has been an abnormal year for people buying fuel oil. That has put pressure onto them. I don't disagree with that. That's one of the reasons why we put forward a policy of giving a rebate to people who are in lower incomes. And because of that, we felt that that program was necessary.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Health recently released a timeline for how it will spend new federal funding for health care. According to the document, Mr. Speaker, the minister intends to spend the entire $75 million CHST supplement in the coming 2003-04 budget year. My question to the minister is, would she please explain how spending the entire federal CHST healthcare supplement in year one, an election year, will contribute to a sustainable healthcare system?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe that is a budget question. I just read, and I refer that question.
Order, please. If the Honourable Minister interprets it being a budget question, you don't have to answer it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Then I'll refer that question to the Minister of Finance.
If it's a budget question or a question directly related to the budget, which will be released tomorrow, the Honourable Minister of Finance does not have to answer it, and we'll ask for the supplementary question. Well, that's up to the Minister. Anyway.
Speaker, in regards to the question from the honourable member opposite, I do believe that is a question that is pertainable to...
Order, please. Order. Obviously, honourable members are questioning whether the Speaker would interpret whether there's not any minister can get up in the House and not answer any question if he doesn't want to. So, I listen. So I've listened to the question. If the Honourable Minister of Finance wants to attempt to answer without answering directly related to the budget, he can. If not, I'll ask for the supplementary question. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Speaker, in my opinion, that is a budget question. The budget will be tabled tomorrow. I'll answer the questions then.
Supplementary.
Speaker, it's no wonder the healthcare system is in such a state in this province. That bunch over there can't tell a healthcare question from a financial question. And that's precisely the problem with healthcare in this province. Mr. Speaker, Commissioner Romano made it clear that investing more money in health care without reforming the system is not going to help stabilize health care in this country. Mr. Speaker, sustainability of health care was the question, and it's the #1 issue on the minds of Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, the federal budget allows provinces to spread out the $75 million over 3 years. And my question to the minister is, can she assure Nova Scotian families that every cent of the additional federal money for health care is going to go toward frontline health care and not to pay for Tory tax cuts?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, the answer to that question is yes.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, by front-loading the $75 million in the health care system in this budget period, this government is going to create a dramatic $44 million drop in federal funding for health care in the year 2004-05. So I want to ask the Minister of Health, when will you admit your government is using the Romano funding for a Conservative election campaign instead of investing in a sustainable health care system?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the member opposite brought up the Romano report, because the Romano report and the Kirby report and all the other health reports done for governments across Canada point out that health care is very much about money, and it's very much about sustainability. And that is exactly what this government is interested in. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier. Speaker, last week the Valley Regional Hospital cancelled 62 surgeries for a variety of reasons. 23 beds in a hospital are being occupied by patients for nursing home beds, or there was a lack of nurses that resulted that were there to care for them. Mr. Speaker, it's very clear to us on this side of the House the government and this Premier has failed to manage the health care system, and Nova Scotians are paying for it with their health. My question to the Premier, given that his government likes to talk about his successes in nurse recruitment, could the Premier explain to the House today how a recruitment process for nurses can be deemed successful if 18 positions at the Valley Regional Hospital failed to yield one single application? 18 vacant positions, no applications. Can the Premier explain to the House the success of his recruitment for nurses?
Mr. Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Health.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, overall, the member for Dartmouth East knows full well that we are retaining more nurses every year, more nurses every year than when we came to government. But Mr. Speaker, the member opposite knows also that every hospital in every district will have its problems from time to time. I'm glad to say the Valley is taking concrete steps there by forming a nursing council on their own to try to solve some of those problems. The positions are funded, and we are working together to try to solve that issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Dartmouth East on your first supplementary.
They'll work on their problems, Mr. Speaker. I think she got the last part of that right. But, Mr. Speaker, the public will judge, and they'll judge on the facts. The Valley region has indicated that the lack of nurses has forced the cancellations in surgery. Now, we hear about the read with interest, the Health Matters document, with the states that we are hiring more nurses, like the minister has just said. To the Premier, I will ask again, there are 18 positions at the Valley Regional Hospital for which there was not a single application. How can the Premier speak for his government and say that anywhere that we are hiring more nurses? How can he support his minister in her statement of that?
The Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Health.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, we are hiring more nurses. The numbers are up. I repeat, that doesn't mean there won't be individual situations where there are difficulties hiring nurses or hiring doctors, for that matter, Mr. Speaker. And I regret that at the moment those positions are unfilled, Mr. Speaker, but they will be filled. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, again I say the facts will speak for themselves, and I'm not saying she's misleading the House, but she's not being forthright with the House here today. And I'll table statistics from the College of Registered Nurses to proof that nurses have left Nova Scotia, and I'd like to table the statistics from the college. Like them or not, Mr. Premier, these are the facts. And we have 1,199 fewer nurses in 2003 licensed to practice in Nova Scotia than in 1999.
1,100.
Bill 68 alone, Mr. Speaker, saw a reduction of 1,230 nurses. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier, given that this government publicly repeats on a regular basis that we have more nurses in Nova Scotia today than in 1999, that is simply not true. And can the Premier please explain to me when the number 8,439 became greater than 9,638 when you compare the year 1999 with 2003?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Health.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, retaining and attracting nurses is a priority of this government. We've announced new nursing seats. Mr. Speaker, we are providing monies and bursaries for students to stay in this province. We have a nursing strategy, and that strategy is working. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax-Shabukdo.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I have a question for the Minister responsible for the Emergency Measures Organization. Mr. Speaker, Monday's flood was a textbook example of the type of extreme weather event scientists are predicting as a result of climate change. It is very typical of the type of extreme weather event which will become increasingly more common in Nova Scotia. The devastating effect of this can be seen in the damage that was done in places like Prospect, Truro, Dartmouth, Lunenburg, in fact, pretty well all over Nova Scotia. Yet yesterday, what the minister said was that the damage is possibly unprecedented in our history. And yet this is exactly the kind of event that scientists have been telling us for decades is about to occur. Will the minister admit that his government has not adequately prepared Nova Scotians for the regular occurrence of this type of extreme weather event?
The Honourable Minister responsible for the Emergency Measures Organization.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, the Emergency Measures Organization of Nova Scotia has made some giant steps in providing services to the municipalities throughout Nova Scotia over the past number of years in preparing them for any disasters. We cannot predict a disaster. If only we could, but we can't. All we can do is be as prepared as we can be, not knowing the disaster that's coming. And we are very confident that the emergency measures organizations throughout Nova Scotia, managed through the municipal units, are managing this disaster as well as could be expected given the fact that they didn't know it was coming in the first place. Thank you very much.
Now, member for Halifax-Shabukdo on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the point is that we all do know that these extreme weather events are coming, and it's something that's a responsibility of the whole of that government. And I'd like to turn to another minister, the minister responsible for municipal relations. What the ministers have to understand is that climate change means that this type of severe weather event will occur more often. Floodplains can no longer be determined based purely on historical data, but we must now include in our calculations the impact of climate change. So this has a significant impact for people living in areas like the floodplain around Truro. It has a significant impact on people who today were evacuated from the banks of the Tuscot River. So I would like to ask the minister what he is going to do about land use planning in this province to avoid exposure of homes and businesses to the damage from the next bad storm.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the honourable member does raise a very valid concern that I'm sure all the municipalities across this province have. And what we will be doing, Mr. Speaker, is working with the UNSM, working with the planning areas to develop those strategies that we can try to mitigate these problems in the future.
The honourable member for Halifax-Shabukto on your final supplementary.
Of course, my point, Mr. Speaker, is that this should have been anticipated, and this, as I said, is a matter that affects several government departments. My last question is for the Minister of Environment. Now, this week's flood illustrates very dramatically just how real global climate change is and how terrible its effects can be on all of us in Nova Scotia. In provinces like Manitoba, they have established a Climate Change Action Fund under a program they recently adopted called Kyoto and Beyond. Will the Minister of Environment commit now to take this problem seriously and work to revisit this province's inadequate energy strategy so that the timetable for effective action is moved up very seriously?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I know that in the middle of winter I certainly wish that global warming would hurry up and come along. But however, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member has raised a serious question and deserves a serious answer. And I will take the matter under advisement and have a departmental official contact him to discuss the matter with him.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Premier forgot about his fiscal policies, and today he's changing his agenda of fiscal management in this province as he goes along. He has failed to give us the name of one company that uses the practices that have been used by this government of adding to the debt without a plan on paying it back. And so he has also made mention of third parties who have endorsed the accounting procedures of this government. Mr. Speaker, there's one that he didn't mention. It's the Dominion Bond Rating Service, which in its last report, May 31st, 2002, said, quote, fueled by continued DBRS-adjusted deficits and capital advances to Crown corporations, however, total debt should resume its upward trend in 2002-2003, ending the year at an estimated $12.8 billion, or 50.7% of the provincial GDP. Growth in the province's debt level expected to continue at a rate of $100 to $200 million per year for at least the next 3 years, which suggests that debt charges will continue to consume a significant portion of fiscal revenues for the foreseeable future. Mr. Premier, you said in 1999 you would live within your means, you would not add to the debt, you would not mortgage the future of your grandchildren or our children. I ask you again today why you are continuing the Tory legacy of borrowed money that will be left for our children and your grandchildren to pay.
The Honourable the Premier.
I refer that to the Minister of Finance.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, in regards of our debt to GDP ratio, obviously that is something the member opposite has brought up, which is something that's very important, because since we have taken office till to the end of the fiscal year that's just ended, there's been a marked improvement in that, Mr. Speaker. If I remember correctly, it's 46.4 to about 42.5% that's gone down. That, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, that reflects the province's capability to repay that debt. Mr. Speaker, I should point out that under that member and the previous administrations, that percentage was going up year over year over year. Since this government has come to power, Mr. Speaker, every year of its mandate, that percentage has gone down. Now, Mr. Speaker, that speaks about our commitment to the people.
Just remind the honourable members, order, please. Just remind the honourable members to keep their questions and answers a little bit shorter, please, for the sake of other members. The honourable member for Richmond on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would remind you, Mr. Premier, the question was to you, sir. You know your Minister of Finance has made a personal decision not to be here after the next budget and not to be here to be held accountable for the decisions to be made in that budget. Therefore, sir, I would put to you that it's your responsibility to answer the questions about the finances of this province and the commitments that you have made. Mr. Speaker, one of the other third parties that have looked at this government's accounting that the Premier did not mention was the Halifax Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce, in fact, started its own program of a debt watch because of this government's inability to control the debt of this province, and it chastised the minister for not having a plan to pay the debt of this province. Mr. Speaker, they also said that the debt of this province was scaring away investors. My question to the Premier: why is he chasing away potential investors, as the Halifax Chamber of Commerce has said, by continuing the uncertainty of more borrowed money in this province?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite indicated that this province has been chasing away investment. over the last 3.5 years, Mr. Speaker, we have created a net increase of 26,000 new jobs in Nova Scotia. Family incomes are increasing monthly. There are more people working today in the province of Nova Scotia than ever before in our history. We are not chasing away investment. We are attracting investment.
The honourable member for Richmond on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Halifax Chamber of Commerce clearly chastised its government for its inability to live within its means and its inability to stop growing the debt of this province. It is they, sir, who said this about your government, not us. Mr. Speaker, the Premier clearly made a commitment in 1999 when he was elected. Yet, Mr. Speaker, after being chastised by the Chamber of Commerce for not having a debt management plan, we are told that the Premier has instructed his political staff to come up with some sort of strategy to try to convince Nova Scotians that they have a plan when there is none in place. So my final supplementary to the Premier. Sir, today will you tell the members of this House and Nova Scotians, does your party and your government actually have a plan to start paying down the debt of this province this year? And if you do, will you table it here today?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad the member continues to allow me to speak on the fiscal success that we've achieved here in Nova Scotia. The Minister of Finance has indicated the very significant improvement we've made in debt-GDP ratio. The Minister of Finance failed, however, to remind members of the House that, in fact, we have reduced the foreign exposure of our debt from 50% to 20%. And in keeping the commitment that we made in the Blue Book, before the election is called, before summer really sets into Nova Scotia, the government will be tabling for the people of Nova Scotia a practical debt reduction plan.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health. You know, Mr. Speaker, there's probably no other community in this province that gave more to the industrial or the energy sector in this whole province than my town of New Waterford, Mr. Speaker. They've provided coal mines upon coal mines. They are the home to the largest generating station in this province that saw one of the greatest beaches in industrial Cape Breton torn apart because of that. But more than that, Mr. Speaker, what we've seen is because of that type of work in the coal mines and the steel mills, we've seen people that have been badly done by these. We've seen the chronic illnesses around that, Mr. Speaker. Now we see another problem facing those people after years of sacrifice for this province. We see the reductions in hours of their emergency room in their hospital. So I want to make a very clear question to the Minister. Why are you allowing the DHA to reduce hours in the emergency room in the New Waterford Consolidated Hospital? Why are you doing that to the people that serve this province so well?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, we are not doing any such thing, Mr. Speaker. The ER in New Waterford is staying open. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Cape Breton Centre on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister knows that's just a short-term solution. It's a get-by-an-election solution, Mr. Speaker. So I want to give her maybe some ideas of how she can support 24/7, Mr. Speaker. There are 24 acute beds at the New Waterford Consolidated Hospital that were transformed into level 2 care. Now, families in that area pay $137.60 per day to stay there. Upstairs, the long-term care beds are bringing in over $3,000 a day to the DHA. Downstairs, the emergency room may or may not be open after the end of September. If residents upstairs get sick at the wrong time of day, they will be taken to Sydney. So I want to ask the minister how she can support the lunacy of long-term care residents living over the emergency room being shipped 20 miles away for 20 minutes in an ambulance that may or may not be in the community.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the recommendation on closing the New Waterford ER was made by a consultant, and obviously the local health authority had a problem with that, and so did we, Mr. Speaker, which is why we provided funding to keep it open while they looked at longer-term solutions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member Cape Breton Centre on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's why I'm here today, Mr. Speaker, because I'm giving her a solution, Mr. Speaker. They get over $1 million a year from the seniors in long-term care in that hospital, Mr. Speaker, money that this government readily takes from seniors in this province. When will the minister step in and ensure that Cape Breton DHA invest some of that money to keep around-the-clock emergency services to the residents of the Waterford?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, we are very interested in working with the DHAs and supporting them and providing health care in their areas, and that is why we provide them with multi-year funding for the next 3 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the Premier's fiscal policies get foggier all the time, the Premier now tells us, as we suspected, that his political staff will have some sort of debt reduction policy, as policy on the fly, as I'd like to describe it, that we will have that after the House probably rises. Speaker, I want to remind the Premier again of some of the statements that he made. In response to a question on April 17, 2001, the Premier said, quote, "What I will confirm is that a year from now, this government will introduce a balanced budget, and from that day onward, the debt of this province will no longer grow." End quote. Mr. Speaker, the debt of this province under Premier Ham and the Tory government has grown $521 million. Tomorrow, it will grow by another $100 million, and the Premier clearly does not intend to hold to the promise that he has given. Therefore, my question to the Premier is, how can you, sir, justify continuing to grow the debt when you said 2 years ago here in this House that the debt would stop growing under your administration, under your balanced budget?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Finance.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I've been listening to the questions from the member opposite. The member opposite is, in his earlier questions, was indicating that that this government had said that we would not add a dime to the debt. Speaker, the member opposite clearly forgets that when we took office, we inherited a $500 million deficit that bunch across the floor had prepared a budget. And the situation, Mr. Speaker, for the member opposite to indicate that we would not add to the debt obviously is a misrepresentation of the facts. We indicated that we would balance the budget in 3 years, Mr. Speaker, but I would point out there were two deficits that we inherited, one of which was the fiscal deficit, but there was another one called the infrastructure deficit, our schools, our hospital, and our bridges, which have to be addressed, and that is why we are borrowing, Mr. Speaker, not in something frivolous, but in the future of our province and its people and its economy.
The honourable member for Richmond on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, once again, the Premier hides behind his Minister of Finance rather than holding himself accountable to the people of Nova Scotia for the promises he has made about the fiscal management of this province. Yet I would remind the Premier, it is you, sir, on page 1 of your Blue Book, who said borrowing hundreds of millions of dollars and mortgaging our children's future without so much as a plan is simply wrong. And you said you would no longer do that. Mr. Speaker, on December 31st, 2001, the Premier wrote in his article in the Chronicle Herald, quote, "The Conservative caucus voted against a budget with a $600 million deficit. I told Nova Scotians that in good conscience I could not support more debt." Well, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is, after $521 million added to our debt, another $100 million, Mr. Premier, where did your conscience go?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Finance.
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I find this line of questioning amazing. We have borrowed, Mr. Speaker, in last year's budget, and we will borrow in this year's budget. And we will borrow for something that is a legacy to the people of our province. It will be schools and hospitals. Mr. Speaker, when the previous government stood up in this House, and the former member for Lunenburg West was the Minister of Finance, he stood up in this House and he had the audacity to say that he had a balanced budget. And he said they were going to borrow $600 million and it was going to come from somewhere. I had no idea. But it wasn't going to build any roads, it wasn't going to build any hospitals, and it wasn't going to build any schools for our children. We will borrow money. The answer is yes. And we will put it to good use for the future of this province. And I make no apology.
Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for order, please. The honourable member for Richmond. Order, please. The honourable member for Richmond on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if you want to see hypocrisy, you will tomorrow witness it in seeing a Minister of Finance and a Premier that will stand before this House and stand before Nova Scotians and tell them that they have a surplus while at the same time they are borrowing $100 million onto the debt on top of the $521 million that they have borrowed since they have been in office. That, Mr. Speaker, is true hypocrisy. Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. Chair's getting a little tired of the long, drawn-out questions, the long, drawn-out answers, and some of the words being used in the House, on both sides of the House. Now, the honourable member just... Order, please. Anyway, the honourable member just used the word twice that I take as being unparliamentary, the word hypocrisy. I'd ask him to retract that, and please, hypocrisy, and please put the final supplementary question while there's still time left in this question period.
Speaker, I will retract that question.
Final supplementary, please.
Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier. You said in your blue book on the term finance on page 28 that during its first mandate, a PC government will commit to allocating a minimum of 1/3 of all annual surpluses to debt reduction. My final question to you, sir, will you commit here today, based on your promise made on the Blue Book, that the surplus you've indicated of $14 million approximately that will be in your budget tomorrow, 1/3 of that will go directly to reducing the debt of this province?
Order, please. The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll do one better than that commitment. Tomorrow, the Minister of Finance will be telling us that there is a very significant surplus in the year 2002-2003, and all of it will go to the debt.
Hey, hey. The honourable member for Halifax Needham. Order, please. The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Community Services and Housing Services. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Community Services and Housing Services are responsible for numerous housing authorities across the province. Gordon B. Eisner Manor, a 16-story building, is one of these. It's a seniors housing complex, Mr. Speaker. And many of the people who live there use wheelchairs, walkers, and portable oxygen. Recently, Mr. Speaker, the only 2 elevators in the building were out of service at the same time for more than 24 hours, stranding people in their apartments if they could not manage up to 16 flights of stairs. I want to ask the Minister, how could he have allowed seniors with limited mobility in a 16-story building to be left without one working elevator for such a long period of time?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for her question. And what she points out is that, in fact, we do provide accommodation for many Nova Scotians through our public housing program. And through that, Mr. Speaker, as she's pointed out, it is managed by 7 regional housing authorities. And they do take responsibility for property management. Part of that would include having an elevator for contract service for their elevators. And I would expect them to be working with the service provider to make sure that the elevators are in working condition. Sometimes things break down, Mr. Speaker, and I understand that they have rectified the problem.
Y'all remember Halifax Needham on your first supplementary.
Well, that's quite a cavalier attitude for the minister to have, Mr. Speaker, of the people, senior citizens, when he's responsible for these issues. Mr. Speaker, elevator problems at Gordon B. Eisner are not an isolated incident in Seniors Manors. Seniors and other residents living at Sunrise Manor have told me of several incidents of having no working elevators in their facility as well. These elevators are constantly breaking down. Mr. Speaker, this is a 10-story building where seniors are routinely without these kinds of services. I want to ask the minister, what is his department's contingency plan to ensure the safety of seniors in these high-rise buildings in the event of an emergency, given that elevator service is such a problem?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member opposite for giving me the opportunity to point out that in Nova Scotia that anybody that operates an elevator needs to have a permit from the Department of Environment and Labour. In order to have that permit, you have to have a service contract with the people that are professional in that area, and clearly any public housing units that have elevators would have such a contract, and the appropriate people are in place to service those elevators. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member Halifax Needham on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's not about whether or not there are contracts. It's about whether or not he is ensuring that business is occurring with these contracts to ensure that people aren't left without vital emergency services when they require them. That's the point. And I haven't heard the minister guarantee that there's any plan. Mr. Speaker, residents of Joseph Howe Manor, another 10-story seniors complex, have also indicated to me that their elevators are unreliable. So I want to ask the minister, will he guarantee that this dangerous situation will not be allowed to occur again at any of the province's seniors housing buildings in my constituency or elsewhere, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can assure the member opposite that the local housing authority, which does wonderful work for helping seniors and other low-income Nova Scotians have not only safe but affordable, appropriate, and sustainable housing. It is a wonderful program, Mr. Speaker, and it is run by wonderful people, and I really appreciate what they do for those Nova Scotians that they serve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, my question today is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, I doubt if many average Nova Scotians, or perhaps even the Premier, knows that the Treasury and Policy Board, also known as a political agency for the Cabinet, is responsible for recommending what schools, roads and bridges are brought forward to Cabinet. All departmental requests for capital spending, except for hospitals, go through the Tangible Capital Asset Prioritization Committee, led by the Treasury and Policy Board. Mr. Speaker, I would ask the Premier, could the Premier table to this House today a list of projects that were submitted to this committee since it was formed, and which specific projects were approved?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer that to the Chairman of the Treasury and Policy Board.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
My light's not on, Mr. Well, as I said, Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for the question. Yes, in fact, Treasury and Policy Board do analysis and make recommendations to Cabinet. I will take the matter under advisement. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Member of Cape Breton South on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I believe that Nova Scotians would like to know today, or at least as soon as possible, exactly where their spending is going. Mr. Speaker, on June 17, 1999, the leader of the Tory party said, and I quote, "In the final analysis, this decision is based on my belief that successful elements in politics is being honest with the people and telling them the truth," close quote. The Premier should demonstrate that honesty here today. The government has already announced $335 million in promises, yet nobody knows which of the capital projects were actually approved by this committee and which ones were made on the basis of politics. Even worse, Mr. Speaker, residents in places like Barrington or Dominion might have been entitled to a new school, but were overlooked because a cabinet minister might have wanted a school in his own area. If this government is truly honest, Mr. Speaker, why won't the Premier simply table a list of what projects were submitted to the TCA committee and which ones were recommended by the committee?
The Honourable the Premier.
As
The Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite, if he has any concern about the projects we have announced, does he think that the schools we have announced are the wrong schools? Does he think the roads we paved are the wrong roads? Does he think that the improvements we made in hospitals were inappropriate? If he has specific concerns about the action of the government, let him ask those questions.
Yes. The honourable member for Cape Breton South on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I am concerned because we believe they're politically motivated, and I'm asking him to tell this House whether or not the list is going to be sent to this House so the Nova Scotians will know as soon as possible exactly what the capital projects are. Mr. Speaker, I believe Nova Scotians are looking... Mr. Speaker, I quote the Premier again on this. I believe Nova Scotia... This is the Premier. I believe Nova Scotia are looking for that kind of leadership, a dedication to place the public interest before any partisan considerations. And he states elections are a time for the politics. But there is no place for it in the daily operation of the government. It costs money and creates chaos, close quote. Therefore, Nova Scotians have a right to know, Mr. Speaker, whether road and school projects are approved on a non-partisan basis or a political basis. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier. Why is the Premier trying to hide this information from Nova Scotians' right to know?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The member opposite should know, ought to know, that in fact the priorities of schools are set by the school boards. If he has an argument with those priorities, let him address the school boards.
The honourable member for Halifax Shabako.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Environment and Labour. Mr. Speaker, that minister and his officials have insisted that the Black Bull mine will not threaten the Tobiatic Wilderness area. They have claimed that by monitoring the Black Bull, his department can stop any potential harm before it starts. But, Mr. Speaker, this week's storm provides an important lesson. Rain like that would overflow the capacity of any such mine's settling ponds. Nearby watersheds would have been contaminated. Minister, there are 20 people here today as representatives of those who are concerned about the future of this invaluable area. What will it take for you and your department to stop this mine and truly weigh up all the facts?
Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, while in this province we welcome industrial ventures coming into the province, Speaker, we must always measure the advantages of that industrial development with damage to the environment. Mr. Speaker, we have done so in the case of the Black Bull mine and the Tobiatic Reserve.
The honourable member for Halifax Shabako on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, many of us are not convinced, and here's why. Black Bull Resources wants to mine kaolin. Obtaining an approval to mine kaolin directly has proved incredibly difficult because it's so dangerous. But what Black Bull has done is they managed to get an approval to mine quartz, and they'll get kaolin as a byproduct. Kaolin is an incredibly fine substance. It can contaminate water sources. It kills wildlife. Kaolin is going to be stored on site. It's going to be suspended in water, pumped into settling ponds. Remember those storms. Minister, extreme weather conditions will continue. How can you and your department guarantee that this mine will not damage the Tobiatic Wilderness area?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Speaker, we've put in place an environmental effects monitoring program. We have, in effect, a community liaison committee. Mr. Speaker, we're doing everything we can, and there is a constant monitoring for that mine when it gets into production, but it's not in production at the present time.
The honourable member for Halifax Shabako on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in case his officials have not drawn it to the minister's attention, let me remind him that this province has not undertaken a Class 2 environmental assessment for about 5 years, and certainly not for that project so immediately adjacent to the Tobiatic. Right. Environmental groups across this province have been struggling to protect the Tobiatic Wilderness in its entirety for decades. And more than 20 people are sitting in the gallery today convinced that decisions by this government will put this internationally unique area at risk. The destruction of that area would have vast economic and social implications. why will the minister not weigh up all the facts and act accordingly? That's what I'd like to know from the minister.
Now, Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I am convinced that we have in place the necessary arrangements that will ensure that Toby Attic Reserve is not contaminated, is not violated by this particular mine.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Mr. Speaker, I have a question to the Honourable Minister of Labour concerning this large book. It's 390 pages long. It contains 197 footnotes and was prepared by 8 authors and was released 13 months ago. And it is entitled The Nova Scotia Workers' Compensation Program, a Focused Review. I wonder if I might ask the minister, through you, Mr. Speaker, whether the government, now given 13 months to focus its review on workers' compensation, has come up with any action other than the one bill that we passed last fall concerning supplementary benefits.
The honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we are indeed continuing to review the report, and that there will be probably legislation coming forward later this year to implement some of those recommendations.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, later this year could well mean after the election. I think it might be more credible if the legislation were to come forward now and be passed by the House, and then they could take their case to the people saying, look what we've done, rather than these future expectations. But in any event, I'd like to ask the Minister of Labour, with respect to the bill we passed last fall on supplementary benefits, is the minister aware of the great difficulty that new entrants, new applicants have in applying for those supplementary benefits? My understanding is that the new applicant now cannot be paid until October the 1st minimum or later, depending on how long it takes for the paperwork to be done.
The honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Speaker, a couple of things with reference to what the honourable member for Cape Breton Nova has been speaking of. Number one, when I say there will be legislation coming forward, possibly in the fall, it will be brought forward by this government, Mr. Speaker. And secondly, and secondly, Mr. Speaker, if he has some particular knowledge of delays for people lasting until October, I wish you would bring them to my attention.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, over the years I have avoided making political promises, but I can promise you this, that I shall do as the minister requests, because I have an abundance of evidence, very thick. I have 2 files right here. I'm not going to table them because I don't intend to read from them, but there's lots of evidence right there, as well as the content of this report, that there's plenty wrong with workers' compensation. And since it's taken the government 13 months to deal with one of the many recommendations contained in this report, would the minister, with his ability to foretell the future, give us some idea of how long it might take before perhaps recommendation number 2 might be acted on?
Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I'm receiving advice from behind me which says soon, very soon, but I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that there will be legislation forthcoming in the fall.
The honourable member for Halifax, Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health Promotion. Mr. Speaker, the regulations under the Smoke-Free Places Act refer to ventilation standards of the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers. I will table a press release from that organization, Mr. Speaker, dated February of this year. The Society has removed smoking areas from its standards for ventilation and now applies those standards only to non-smoking buildings, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Minister of Health Promotion is, how can his department allow its regulations to be based on non-existent standards?
The honourable Minister of Health Promotions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what the member refers to with respect to ASHRAE, Mr. Speaker, is for the purposes of designing the systems. The numbers itself, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the inflow-outflow are designated in the regulations.
The honourable member for Halifax, Needham on your first supplementary.
Well, I would recommend that the minister read the press release, because the society make it quite clear that the standards are based on ventilation for non-smoking areas now. And it also makes it clear that the ventilation of smoking areas is only to address odor, Mr. Speaker. It does nothing to protect workers who must enter that area from the health hazards of secondhand smoke. Workers like Heather Crow, who is